Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Francis Watch on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, Justin Soder, and this evening I have the great privilege of sharing the company with His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn, Rector of Most Holy Trinity Seminary in Brooksville, Florida, as well as Father Anthony Cekada, Assistant Pastor of St. Church of the Great Catholic Church in Westchester, Ohio. Your Excellency, Father, thanks for coming back to the program.
Yeah, Happy to be here again.
So we'll get some housekeeping out of the way here real quick, and then we'll jump right into it because we once again have a jam-packed show this evening. Francis Watch is sponsored by Novus Ordo Watch. Are you wondering what has happened to the Roman Catholic Church? Are you confused, shocked, and alarmed at what Francis has been saying? Then log on to novusordowatch.org for traditional Catholic news and information with insightful commentary and razor-sharp analysis. Since 2002, Novus Ordo Watch has been exposing the Vatican II Church and its false popes by comparing and contrasting their new religion with the true religion, the modernist Novus Ordo teachings with the teachings of the Catholic Church. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org to see why Francis is not a true pope and how the modernist Vatican II sect differs from the Catholic Church. That's novusordowatch.org. Restoration Radio programs, including this one, are available on restorationradionetwork.com and are syndicated on iTunes and Stitcher. You can follow the work of True Restoration on various social media channels like Facebook and Twitter. Find us by using the social buttons on truerestoration.org. On that site, you'll also find a link to Trad Circle, the social network site founded in 2008 by Father Anthony Cekada and currently moderated by True Restoration staff. One of its original purposes was to enable young people who feel called to marriage to meet like-minded types, but it is also a great and safe place to make new friends and have discussions. People of all ages are welcome. So, Your Excellency and Father, tonight's show is entitled The Bergoglio Consistory Bomb, the Bergoglio Consistory Bombshell. And just before, I think it was on February the 20th was our last show, and we talked about the C8 Reform Council and the Consistory, which is coming up. We examined the topics of relativizing the faith through Bergoglio's constant dialogue and denigrating the systematic exposition of doctrine, promoting his faith as encounters with Jesus notion. We talked about Cardinal Maradiaga, who shot down the CDF head Mueller, and as well as him floating all kinds of ideas that would allow communion for the divorced and remarried. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with who Cardinal Maradiaga is, let me play a clip from the last episode to identify him for you, courtesy of Father Cekada.
Well, one thing you have to say is Maradiaga, first of all, is not just some cardinal who has floated over to Rome on a banana boat from South America, but actually he is I think that was politically incorrect. Actually, he is the top banana of the C8 group of cardinals. And so he has been going around the world, in effect floating these different ideas.
So, Father, we're going to talk more about Cardinal Maradiaga tonight.
So was that intended by Stephen to get maybe the sponsorship of Chiquita Banana? Here, perhaps Chiquita instead of Cekada as a feature.
Indeed. So we're gonna be speaking a lot more about him this evening because his name is back in the news, and just all kinds of topics here. So this is going to be a jam-packed show. I mean, I think all of us are having a hard time keeping up with all this news. So the first story we have on deck for this evening are the ones coming out of the consistory in Rome on the 22nd of February. And there are really a copious amount of storylines that have emerged from the consistory, and not the least of which is Cardinal Walter Kasper's speech given at the consistory. Now, let it also be noted that a lot of these topics we actually discussed on last month's episode of Francis Watch, where Bishop Sanborn very astutely predicted exactly what he thought would be coming down the pike on the subjects of marriage and divorce, and how annulments would be outsourced from Rome to the confessional. So let's go ahead and start off here with the actual bombshell speech. So, Father, Your Excellency, who wants to take this first?
Well, during the consistory, the theme was supposed to be preparation for the October Synod on the Family. The keynote speaker was Cardinal Walter Kasper. Now, Kasper is favorite theologian of Francis, of Bergoglio. In fact, a commentator for the Catholic newspaper in England, the Tablet, said that he's the favorite theologian of the pontificate. So, and in fact, so much so that I think in the second or third day after Bergoglio's election, he actually recommended a book that Caspar had written. So Caspar gave the keynote speech on the question of the family and the ideas that he wanted to get across generally about the family. But the section, the last section, the fifth section of the speech, was the one that was the most controversial because it deals with the question of sacraments for those who are divorced and remarried. Now, that was something that has been consistently forbidden in the church, but it was an idea that Bergoglio very much had on his mind. He spoke about it in the interview that he gave on the plane coming back from World Youth Day, and speculating that perhaps there could be a way to give these people who were validly married before, who are divorced and who are living in a second marriage, way of giving them sacraments. So Caspar was trotted out to give a speech on this, and in effect to come up with a justification for doing what Bergoglio wanted to do. Basically, it boiled down to two proposals. On one hand, Caspar proposed, in effect, allowing the parish clergy to annul marriage. He said that some of the divorced and remarried are subjectively convinced that their previous marriage was irreparably broken. In many cases, their local priest was convinced of this. And he went on to say that rather than having this decided perhaps by a tribunal, perhaps this can be left to a lower level. And this would be very much in line with a speech, actually, that Francis gave to the Supreme Marriage Court, Vatican Marriage Court earlier. So that was the first proposal. You let Father Chuck in the parish essentially decide whether or not the first marriage was valid. As far as the second proposal, this one Caspar based on a 1972 article by Ratzinger. The idea here was that, well, you make the second marriage a somewhat penitential marriage, provided you meet certain criteria, and I guess you undergo a little period of penance, and then thereafter you are allowed to receive the sacraments. So this was the second proposal, and cleverly put because, of course, he invoked Ratzinger, who is still popular in the conservative wing of the Novus Ordo Church. So those were the two proposals that Caspar came up with.
Now, yes, and both of them are ridiculous and against the faith.
Well, Father, we came up here with two quotes from this document that either Ratzinger wrote in 1972. This is actually courtesy of Novus Ordo Watch. They sent this over just before the show aired. And these are the two things that Ratzinger had to say in 1972. The first one is this, quote, where a marriage first broke up a long time ago and in a mutually irreparable way, and where conversely a marriage consequently entered into has proven itself over a longer period as a moral reality and has been filled with the spirit of the faith, especially in the education of the children, the possibility should be granted in a non-judicial way based on the testimony of the pastor and church members for the admission to communion of those who live in such a second marriage. And the second quote here from the same document is this: the requirement that a second marriage has proven itself over a long time as a moral greatness and have been lived in the spirit of the faith in fact corresponds to the type of forbearance that is palpable in Basil, where after a long penance, communion is granted to the one living in a second marriage without terminating the second marriage. Now, okay, Your Excellency, let me ask you this question. Let's talk about the red meat in those two quotes. Ratzinger explicitly quoted that in a second marriage, meaning someone who is divorced and remarried, that it can prove itself over a long period to be a moral reality. And then he reasserts the point and further says, over a long time, a second marriage can become a moral greatness. So just what does a long time have to do with the effect of morality?
Well, it is true that many times people who get divorced and remarry are more happily non-married, let's put married in quotation marks, in their second false marriage than they were in their true marriage. That is true. That's my experience. That they sort of have learned a lesson and they choose spouses that are more compatible. But that has absolutely nothing to do with the indissolubility of marriage. The fact that two people get along very nicely has absolutely nothing to do with the indissolubility of marriage. The first marriage is a contract made before God, which, as St. Paul says, is an imitation of the sacred relationship that exists between Christ and the church. And that cannot be broken any more than the sacred relation between Christ and the church can be broken. It is a sacramental marriage. First of all, marriage by the natural law is indissoluble, but also by the supernatural law is indissoluble. And therefore the Catholic Church has always had the practice of telling people who are in bad marriages and who are separated that they can never marry again, and that they are still married to their spouses from whom they have been separated, and they have to conduct themselves as married persons. That has always been said. It is the history of the Church. This attempt is another aspect of Vatican II. Vatican II wants to draw all of the disaffected back to the quote-unquote Catholic religion. So it's looking to fill up the churches in Europe, which are basically empty right now, with these divorced and remarried people. Well, if you can come back and receive communion, you'll be a nice, good Catholic, and then we'll have something in the collection basket. And just to build up the quote-unquote the life of the church. And so they're willing to throw out the window, throw in the trash, the sacred doctrine concerning the indissolubility of marriage, which is based in sacred scripture itself, words of our Lord and St. Paul, explicit words. This is getting really hardcore, that they would be willing even to discuss such a thing. So that's the first thing that needs to be said about this, that parish clergy annul marriages is, it used to have to be reviewed by Rome, and the marriage is something that regards the entire church. So you can't be married in one parish and not married in the next because the pastor of one parish doesn't think you got an annulment. It's something that regards the entire church and therefore has to be judged at a high level. And it's just absurd. What parish priest is qualified to decide concerning a marriage? It has to go to trial. There has to be witnesses. It's just an absurdity. So let's pull away the mask. This is a rather bold attempt, and at the same time stupid, of trying to provide for Catholic divorce and remarriage. That's all it is. Let's face it. Let's call it what it is.
One thing that I would
go ahead.
One thing I would add, Your Excellency, that I see in it, that I see in the quotes from Ratzinger, is poking its head out, is the modernist consequentialist morality. That the idea is that, we had a problem in the first marriage, but now we are able to achieve this moral greatness in the second marriage, and we weigh the indissolubility of the bond against the current situation which we have now, the consequences of which seem on the surface to be very good, and then we choose the second consequence, the second option. And that's how the moral system consequentialist morality operates. And that's something that we see time and time again. And it's the product of the modernism of the 60s, and it's still around.
I think Ratzinger wrote this when he was still a radical theologian.
Mm-hmm.
When he became the Archbishop of Munich, he went through his metamorphosis and decided that he was going to at least have a conservative shell. But I think this is when he was bolder, 1972. I don't think he would have said this when after his Munich conversion, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And then the penitential marriages that he's referring to is a complete misapplication of the ancient discipline of the church. There was a discipline at a certain point where in some places where you could not marry a second time if you had been widowed. And so therefore there was this legislation concerning second marriage because it was against the law of the church in certain cases to get married a second time in certain localities and so forth. And so that's all it concerns. It has nothing to do with what they want it to be, and that is some sort of primeval approval of adultery against the explicit statements of our Lord Jesus Christ and St. Paul concerning marriage.
Casper made appeals supposedly to the ancient discipline of the church when he made this speech, and when I first read it, I thought, "Come on, this is where did this stuff come from?" I never heard such a thing. Well, it turned out that this Professor Di Mattei, an Italian conservative commentator who's been very critical of some things in the Bergoglio circus, pointed out that this idea was debunked a long time ago. That during the first 5 centuries, he quoted a study that said, during the first 5 centuries of the Christian era, no decree by a council or any declaration by a father of the church which sustains the possibility of the matrimonial bond can be found. And then he goes on to say, in every part of the world, the church regarded the dissolving of the marriage bond as impossible, and divorce with the right to a second marriage was completely unknown. So the Casper reheated an argument that was refuted a long time ago, and one which common sense would tell you wouldn't hold any water. Otherwise, we would have heard about it long before now.
Yeah, well, Father, I think you're just being black and white. Casper says life isn't black and white in the same speech. I think all you clerics love to paint things. It's black and white. But life isn't black and white. Doesn't Cardinal Casper have a point there?
Certainly not in his system.
Well, I think it is symptomatic of the disease of the age, and that is that there is nothing true except that there is nothing true. That it is pure skepticism. Everything is subjected to subjectivism. There is no objective reality or truth about anything, and all of it has to be torn down. Like any vestiges of objective morality or of objective dogma have to be torn down, and this so-called pontificate is going to do it.
I think it's a good time to circle back around for just 1 second, Your Excellency, to something you said 30 days ago. And I'm playing this for the benefit of our listeners because the speech hadn't happened yet regarding this idea of having confessional marriage annulments. And this was your prediction 30 days ago.
They're going to go in and say, well, the few that do, those are empty closets, most of those reconciliation rooms and all. Nobody goes in them, and they're useful for brooms and other things. For the few people that are going to bother to go in, the priest is going to ask them, are you in good conscience about your failed marriage and your new spouse? And the person will say, yes, I'm in good conscience. Then it'll be go in peace.
This, though, is what one can see. Happen. There will be some sort of formulation or directive that will allow this. There will be the hope that this will maintain the fiction that we're still adhering to the divine law, whom God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. But it will simply be maintaining a fiction, because in practice it will be gone.
Well, there you have it. Your Excellency 30 days ago. You should start playing the lottery, because that was, it's almost like you know what you're talking about there.
We should reward him with something, maybe some Cekada bananas.
Mm-hmm. Banana split, maybe,
Yeah. But, you called it very clearly. There it is. You're going to reduce it down to this, do you feel guilty about, your failed marriage? Yes, I do. Okay, go in peace. I mean, I think that's exactly what Casper's lining out here, and he hadn't even said it. You called it.
Well, this is what they have been doing since the 1960s with regard to artificial birth control. And I think I pointed out in the last one, too, that artificial birth control tends to be a little bit more private. And so it can be done better in the confessional in that exact same way. Are you in good conscience about this? And so the pill is taken with the blessing of the priest. This is a public thing. Marriage is public by its very nature. And so this will involve getting over another hurdle and getting over a few people who are a little reticent about it. But they will all cave in. And no matter what anyone says, no matter who raises an objection, they will all cave in. I will predict that.
On the correlation between this and birth control, I would say that this speech and the points made in this particular speech are a question of really letting the horse out of the stable, as it were. Once people hear stuff like this, you can bet that it's going to be applied in the practical order. That there will be priests who will start doing this. Who will in the confessional will appeal to people's conscience, and if they're faced with a divorce and remarriage. So it's going to start all over, just as it did with contraception. That there was a period where there was supposedly a question of how the Pope would rule on whether or not the pill was acceptable. And during those 2 or 3 years, that's when the justification for it, in terms of following your own conscience, that's when that spread and really went forward. So I think we're going to see the same thing with this.
It'd be something like setting up a commission to study whether there are 4 persons or only 3 in the Trinity. It puts the thing in doubt right away. It makes it something that really pertains to faith, a question of doubt. It's something that deserves discussion. And it has all of its damage. It does tremendous damage. The pill was clearly artificial birth control and came under the condemnation that Pius XI gave to it. Clearly it was. Mm-hmm. But yes, when you bring it up for question, we're going to look into it. And Bergoglio said that about cohabitation, various forms of cohabitation. We have to look into it, you see, and each case is different. That immediately destroys the principle. It's something like what Ratzinger did a few years ago, where he said that male prostitutes can use condoms. And then a few days later, when there was a lot of controversy, well, the female prostitutes can use them too. So, as I said at the time, well, do you have to be a card-carrying prostitute in order to qualify for this exemption to use artificial birth control? I mean, why? What qualifies you for this? How do you what sort of thing? Is there a union or something that you have to belong to? And what that does, that concession that he made to the male and female prostitutes to do that, it destroys the whole principle. The whole principle of artificial birth control is something universal. That is, it's intrinsically evil. It can never be done for any reason, even to save your own life or the life of another person. It's intrinsically evil. If you make one exception to that, you destroy everything. The whole building crashes down. And that's what Ratzinger did to the use of condoms, and now this is being done to communion or adultery. Now we're going to have people living in adultery and approaching the so-called communion rail, which doesn't exist anymore. But getting the Novus Ordo communion wafer. That's what we're talking about here. But what is more important is that they, supposedly in the name of Catholicism, will put a blessing upon adultery. That's the outcome of this whole thing. And all of the Novus Ordo conservatives will cave in on it and say nothing has changed and everything is all right.
Well, that takes us to some objections that were raised. This is interesting. From the period of February the 21st until this evening, there have been a litany of objections. And the first one to step up and say something was the Novus Ordo Cardinal Archbishop of the Diocese of Galveston, Houston, in Texas here in the United States, Daniel DiNardo, who essentially was pleading the case of the African bishops, and he said that this speech by Casper and this new thought process which he's laying out for divorce and remarriage undermines the bishops in Africa who are condemning the common practice of polygamy. And this is what he had to say, quote, "If you try something with this, it's going to hurt us on polygamy. They've been telling people that if you come into the church, you've got to choose one wife," DiNardo said. Quote, "If you suddenly change that, couldn't people in polygamous marriages say, 'Can't you give me a break too?'" So it seems to me like what you have here is a little of what's good for the goose is good for the gander. The consequences, they'll say, hey, if someone can have 2 wives, why can't I have 4?
Well, that's perfectly true. If you can have 2, why not have 4? I mean, where do you stop the process of giving communion? How much adultery? How many wives can you have?
Yeah, where's the limit?
Really,
is it like a 6-pack or something?
I think even the Muslims have a limit on how many wives you can have. I think they do. But sure, that logic is there. But really, that comment is sort of a sociological comment. There should be outrage that the words of Jesus Christ have been blasphemously contradicted in the halls of the Vatican. That's what should be said. And that the words of St. Paul condemning adultery have been blasphemously contradicted. Not that the Nigerians or the Africans might think, that this will... That is off the point. Because, yes, it is polygamy. The answer to that question is yes, it is polygamy. There you go.
We're back.
At least polygamy actually is not as bad as adultery in this sense, that to abandon the first wife, who is the real wife or the real spouse, and repudiate her as your spouse, and to marry a second is worse than saying, well, I have many wives. David had many wives. It is considered to be against the secondary aspects of the natural law. But to commit adultery is against the primary aspect of the natural law. And so, I mean, we might say that polygamy is small potatoes in comparison to Europeans living in open adultery and receiving the Novus Ordo communion wafer.
Again, it's the consequentialist thing. You correctly pointed out, Your Excellency, that the objection seems to be from a sociological point of view rather than anything in terms of principle.
Yes. Yes.
And that, as I read in another statement by this Cardinal Caffarra, the Archbishop of Bologna, at least here he speaks about it in terms of consequences again. It is therefore an extramarital exercise of human sexuality that the Church legitimizes, but with this, the foundational pillar of the Church's doctrine on sexuality is negated.
Yes. It's so simple. Just look up the scriptures.
Yeah.
It's so simple. It's wrong. Thou shalt not commit adultery.
So you're just, Your Excellency, you're just being too black and white here. I mean, Cardinal Castro disapproves of your thought process. For those of you,
but that's why I say they will cave in. They will cave
absolutely.
in because that's the way they see it. Well, this is troublesome and bothersome to us, and they will cave in. What they should have done was rip their garments when he said it, and cried out blasphemy. That's what they should have done.
Indeed. Well, for those of you who
Gammarelli would have been very happy. They would have had all kinds of business.
Well, let me get a show bumper in here real quick, Your Excellency. For those of you who are just joining us, you're listening to Francis Watson Restoration Radio Network, episode number 3, the Bergoglio Consistory Bombshell. I'm your host, Justin Soder, and this evening I'm joined by His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn and Father Anthony Cekada. And this evening, we have a phone call here, Your Excellency and Father, as a gentleman on the line here who, his brother is a Novus Ordo priest, and he has a few things to say about annulments. Go ahead, caller.
Good evening, Your Excellency and Father. Thank you for taking my call.
Yes.
As the host was saying, I have a brother who is a newly ordained Novus Ordo priest, and he is a quote-unquote conservative Novus Ordo priest. And I'm a sedevacantist, so we were arguing about how liberal the Novus Ordo Church is with annulments. And he told me something that was surprising to justify why the Church should grant so many annulments and allow for remarriage. And I don't think this is just his opinion. I get the impression that this is what other Novus Ordo priests are saying behind closed doors, even the more conservative ones. And he told me that he thinks that more than half of the Novus Ordo marriages that are taking place today are invalid. One, because the couple doesn't really understand the true nature of marriage. They're so imbued with a secular notion of marriage rather than the proper Catholic understanding of it. And two, that many of them go into it already planning on practicing birth control, which would invalidate it. And I'm just wondering how you would respond to that as a justification for granting annulments. Those two reasons: one, that they don't have a proper Catholic understanding, even though they're going to the pre-Cana classes, and two, that they intend to practice artificial contraception.
Well, first, if they don't have a Catholic understanding of it, that's because the priests don't have a Catholic understanding of it, and they don't preach it from the pulpit. If you look at the old books of like a syllabus of what to preach from the pulpit, it went all through the sacraments, and it went through marriage and the indissolubility of marriage. It means that they have not been instructed, even from the time they were children, in the basics of the catechism, and that falls right on the priests. What would invalidate the marriage is if they really intended to not have a permanent union. Because they would have to explicitly intend basically to live together in some sort of a civil union. That would invalidate the marriage. However, to prove that is very difficult because you have to go to court, you have to have witnesses who testify that, yes, you said this, I do not intend a permanent union, that I don't consider this an indissoluble marriage, and then an ecclesiastical court will hand down a decision based on that. It becomes absurd when some priest is going to say that in the confessional or while he's standing out in the front of the church. That's just an absurdity. But you would have to be very explicit about excluding that. And most people are not explicit about it. It's right in their formula of marriage, until death do we part, or they have some equivalent of that. This is forever. Even in the Novus Ordo, there is the idea that this is a permanent union. Most of them go through the Cana conferences, pre-Cana and all that. To have this vast number of people who don't know what they're getting into is, to me, absurd. because even the Novus Ordo catechism and Novus Ordo teaching is that this is a permanent union. So, where that might be able to happen in some, isolated cases, and that would have to go to court. The second, the business of birth control, it is true that to exclude or limit the having of children in marriage would invalidate it, but not the mutual agreement to practice birth control. You see, the two people could say, we will not engage in sexual intercourse for 5 years by mutual consent in order to avoid having children. They could say that. They could do that by mutual consent. There is no injustice there. That would not invalidate the marriage. The simple idea of sinning, not that it's right or anything, but that we're mutually consenting to sin in order to prevent conception does not invalidate the marriage, because that does not exclude or limit the right to have children, which is essential to the marriage. It's simply a collusion to sin together. That's all. So he's wrong about that. The idea a collusion or an agreement to abuse marriage does not invalidate the marriage.
Thank you, Excellency.
Okay, well, thank you for the phone call. We appreciate that. Your Excellency, Father, let's go ahead and move on here. We have some more objections here, and the next one is from Cardinal Burke. Now, let's also say something
Cardinal
about this
who?
real quick. Yes, Cardinal Burke, Raymond Burke.
Oh, Burke. Okay.
Yes, he had the apostolic signature. Now, let's make one thing clear. No one likes Burke in Rome. I mean, he is a holdover from the past who's out of touch. I mean, this is the guy who still wears the cassock and surplice and choir, while the rest of him around, wearing Novus Ordo horse blankets. And this is one of those people who Bergoglio would say has a sourpuss theology and worries about stuff like doctrinal truth. So let's see what this Neo-Pelagian creed-reciting parrot Christian's thoughts are on Casper's statement. He says...
Probably says the rosary, too.
Burke says here, quote, "It must be clear that the annulment process is not a mere matter of procedure, but that the process is essentially connected with the doctrinal truth of the Church. Discussions on the matter are creating a great deal of potential disillusionment that somehow we can withhold the truth about marriage. We are talking about the very words of Christ himself in the Gospel, in which he taught the indissolubility of marriage." Well, doctrinal truth. Obviously, Burke is marching to a different beat of a different drummer. And, I mean, I'm waiting here to see a Cardinal Ottaviani moment here with Burke where he gets his microphone disconnected.
Oh, no. He is the show dinosaur of the Novus Ordo. He is the dinosaur fixture in the Novus Ordo, and he's there for a reason. You are talking about, I mean, what world is he living in? This country has been giving out over 50,000 annulments a year for about the past 30 years. I mean, what world is he living in? He's an American, too.
Yes, he is.
For him to say, well, the annulment process is based on truth and all, I mean, it has been a joke for the past 30 years, at least. Even before that, by the late 70s, it had become a joke. And so for him to say that, it just shows that he's living in some sort of a dream world, like a wishful thinking world, in which there is still a Catholic hierarchy that is observing Catholic dogma concerning marriage. It is an absurdity, and therefore his comment is absurd. It's like he has dementia or something, or he's living, in 1954. I just can't take it seriously.
Well, no one else does. That's for sure. We had another story here. I think this was on Rorate Celi on I think it was on the 14th of March here, where it said that we have a whole group of cardinals here coming out. We have Cafara, Mueller, Brand Mueller, Baganasco, Ray, Torrens, Scola, Marini, and Cardinal Marini was very, very critical. He said that, quote, "I don't know if I understood Casper's speech very well, but at this moment, about 85% of the cardinals have expressed opinions apparently contrary to the layout of Casper's report. So 85%, Your Excellency, I'll play the devil's advocate here real quick. So, we have 85% apparently of the quote-unquote cardinals who are against this. Now, the conservative Novus Ordos would say, hey, this is great. We have 85% objection. And what's the problem here, Your Excellency? Can't you acknowledge that 85% are against this?
Well, first I would say Marini puts his whole comment in doubt by saying, I don't know if I understood Casper or not. Casper was very clear. All you had to do was read his speech. So if he didn't understand his Italian, and it would seem like somebody by the name of Marini should understand the Italian in the conclave, you could have read it in Italian the next day in the newspaper, as I did. And it was as clear as anything what Casper was saying. He was talking about adultery. Adultery. So for him to say, how can you, I don't know if I understood Casper. That already puts him in a category of being, somebody out of contact with reality. How can we take seriously what he says about those other cardinals?
Well, I think I read the 85% a little bit differently. I read it that what he meant was 85% of those who had gotten up to speak on the topic objected to it, which or made negative comments about it, at least, which would seem to, that would be something he'd be able to tell, I suppose. The interesting thing is that there is some pushback on it from some of the older cardinals, but that's I don't see anyone leading a revolt.
No, they will all cave in. This is just sort of jitters and sweats and things like that. It's like, oh my goodness, here's another chasm we have to cross. And when this goes down, this is another tower of the church coming crashing down. That's all. It's just a lamentation more than an objection. Because it is so bad that the only proper response to it is something equally bad. And that is that this, as I said, is heresy, it's blasphemy, it's contrary to sacred scripture. I had a Novus Ordo priest say to me the other day, are they going to just completely ignore what our Lord said in sacred scripture? That's what he said to me. I said, apparently they are. This is an ordinary priest in the Novus Ordo, and he can figure it out. That's the only proper response to this. So that's why I say, mark my words, they will all cave in. They will all cave in.
Well, lest anyone
you can play that on the next show.
Yes, I will. Lest anybody here think that this commotion of objection and concern, about the Casper theorem is going to gain any steam, we have Bergoglio weighing in the very next day, praising Casper and letting everybody know that the Casper train is leaving the station and that they should be on board with the man who Bergoglio describes as the theologian of his pontificate. This is what Bergoglio had to say about Casper's speech, or what we call the Casper theorem here. Quote, yesterday I read, or rather reread, the work of Cardinal Casper, and I would like to thank him because I found profound theology and even serene thinking in theology. It is pleasant to read serene theology. And I also found what St. Ignatius told us about the Sensus Ecclesiae, love for Mother Church. It did me good, and an idea came to me. Excuse me, Eminence, if I embarrass you, but the idea is that this is called doing theology on one's knees. Thank you. Thank you. Unquote. Doing theology on one's knees.
Maybe I'll refrain from comment on that one.
Yeah. Father, you're not allowed to touch this. You're not allowed to touch this.
The really interesting thing about this is that Bergoglio had apparently these reactions, cardinals speaking against these proposals, and then he's laying the law down the next day. Now, when I first read that quote about sensus ecclesiae and profound theology, the word of the objections hadn't managed to leak out yet. But obviously, he's telling them it's time to get on board.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. You can see it's part of his agenda. The fact that he would bring it up on that plane coming back from Rio, it shows that this is on his mind. And he seems to be a very determined person, a person who pursues his agenda very efficaciously.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Yes, and he knows they will cave in too. He knows that.
Well, go ahead, Father.
There's another quote. The same day that Bergoglio praised the Casper speech, another interview was published, and here's the quote from him. The question is not that of changing the doctrine, but to go deep and ensure that pastoral care takes into account situations and what is possible for people. This must be done thoughtfully and without falling into casuistry, because this would inevitably diminish the quality of our work. So again, he's determined to reinforce that idea that this is what we're going to do, and everyone better go along with it.
Yes, and at the same time, maintain the facade of Catholic doctrine.
Yes.
That on the one hand, it's indissoluble, and so all of the Novus Ordo conservatives nod their heads, yes, the Holy Father is protecting doctrine. And then in the pastoral world, that is, in the day-to-day dealings with the faithful, they will permit them to remain in adultery and to receive the sacraments, thereby approving of adultery. And so that's his solution. So he's got the best of both worlds. He can get up and say, I've not changed anything, and at the same time, everything has changed. And that's you can see it, that substitution of the pastoral, that there's a difference between the pastoral and the doctrinal, that the pastoral is another world that operates by other principles.
And again, the same trick as with birth control. Absolutely,
yes.
The same thing that they did. Mm-hmm.
This is as old as the 1960s. I mean, this is like the flower children. This is as old as Volkswagen buses and whatnot.
Yeah.
It's just that it is coming out of the closet, so to speak, because birth control is something private. This is just the same principle coming out of the closet. These Novus Ordo priests and bishops and all have been doing this for decades.
Well, then we have, so this really is more or less Bergoglio doubling down on his critics in the consistory. He's telling them, hey, get on board, this is how it's going to be, and I really don't care what you have to say about this.
Yes, so he has an agenda, he's going to pursue it.
Mm-hmm. The other interesting thing that I came across, in fact, I just noticed it today, when you put the sequence together of what happened. The speech was delivered, then Bergoglio reinforces it with two quotes the next day. The speech of Casper was not really supposed to be published. It was delivered, under wraps and in secret and so on. But
I wonder if it was ghostwritten. Casper the Friendly Ghost. No, go ahead.
No, I think that's a cultural illusion that's lost on another generation.
I think.
But it ended up published, and the account that I read of its publication today said that it was from La Stampa, and it said that it was published because the decision came from the top that it was opportune to publish it. So in other words, it ended up in the press because Bergoglio wanted it diffused throughout the world, and to show to the objectors that this is in fact his program.
Yes, also to put down the objections to it and to gather popular support for it, so that the objectors are lose the ground under them, and will just keep quiet.
Mm-hmm.
That certainly was, I'm sure, the case. That's what they did at the council. Anybody that objected to anything at the council was in some way ruined or vilified. It's like Cardinal Taviani when they cut off the microphone and everyone cheered. I mean, the whole spirit of it is one of forcing an issue down everybody's throats. If you don't like it, it's bad.
Well, now we move on here to an article in the National Catholic Reporter that was on the 11th of March, where Casper is essentially on the apologetic tour now and is saying, well, I am going to propose to maintain but yet reinterpret doctrine. And like I said, this is a National Catholic Reporter article, and it says here, in its approach to divorced and civilly remarried Catholics, the Catholic Church needs to find a middle ground that does not destroy or abandon doctrine, but offers a renewed interpretation of church teaching in order to help those whose marriages have failed, Cardinal Walter Casper said. Quote, I propose a path that goes beyond strictness and leniency. An approach that avoids two extremes isn't against morality. It isn't against doctrine, but rather is meant to support a realistic application of doctrine to the current situation of the great majority of people and contribute to people's happiness, unquote. So I guess this is what it's all about now, Your Excellency and Father. It's about contributing to people's happiness. Doctrine thrown to the dogs.
It's a consequentialist morality. And the idea that he is reinforcing is that the rightness or the wrongness of something has to be in proportion to how it makes people happy, whatever happy may mean. That's the first point, and secondly, it seems clear from what he says that again it's this idea of paying lip service to the doctrinal principle and doing an end run around it in practice. That's a typical modernist formulation, a path that goes beyond strictness and leniency. I don't know how many times I heard modernist professors that I had say that, well, that was the teaching maybe at one point, what you quote, but now we're beyond that. We've surpassed it. That's always the idea.
Don't forget, these people believe in evolution of doctrine. They're thoroughgoing modernists. Casper, by the way, was the one, if I'm not mistaken, was it Casper who said that Anglican orders are valid? Was that Casper or was that Murphy O'Connor? It's a number of years ago. But Casper is the liberal and the modernist. I mean, his history is absolutely awful. You can't get somebody that's more left-wing than Casper. I thought it was Casper. Wasn't he involved in ecumenism at a certain point?
Yes, I believe so. Yes, yeah.
Yes, I think he came out with something that Anglican orders are okay. But in any case, it's pure modernism. Reinterpretation of doctrine means changing the doctrine. Again, let's take the mask off and call it what it is. It's changing the doctrine. Did you see that English was Archbishop of Westminster, how he said, well, doctrine doesn't change, but then he by the end of the paragraph it says, well, it changes indirectly. Did you see that?
Yes, I saw that.
Yeah. Even the Wanderer picked up on that one. It's all just double talk and nonsense. It's all just just double talk and nonsense. That's the only word for it.
Well, the other interesting thing about Casper's comment here was I think he also went on to say that, well, this is what we did with ecumenism and religious liberty.
Yes.
Which were condemned before, and so I don't see why we can't do it with the indissolubility of marriage.
Yes.
So it's just it's the argument by analogy. He made that, and I've seen that made elsewhere, and I think we'll be hearing quite a bit about that.
At least they admit that, though.
Mm-hmm.
See, they admit that they contravened the condemnations with regard to ecumenism and religious liberty. That there is a change, and that's something refreshing about those liberals, is that they admit that they did change the doctrine. What is I have to say sickening about the Novus Ordo conservatives is that no matter what happens, they will nod their heads and say nothing has changed, nothing has changed, nothing has changed.
So we've spent the first hour of the program tonight here talking about the bombshell stories coming out of the consistory and, of course, Casper's speech. And I think for the sake of time, Your Excellency and Father, we've got to move on to cover some more of these story topics here that we've covered from the news. And moving on here to the subjects of faith and doctrine and dogma, we start with a story here on the 21st of February, which is one day after our last Francis Watch show, where Bergoglio essentially comes out and says something which supposedly sounds good. And this is something that I think the conservative Novus Ordos are going to say, see, Your Excellency Father, the Holy Father is defending church teaching. Bergoglio gave a homily on the 21st, and essentially he gave a verbatim denial of Catholic dogma as defined by the Council of Trent in the 16th century, when he makes a speech and says, a faith that does not bear fruit in works is not faith, unquote. Now, that's fascinating because, I sense this is one of those slippery moments where critics are going to say, now, come on, you two, you know what the Pope meant. He's just saying faith without works is dead. He may not have articulated it well, but that's what he meant. And you two are twisting it around to suit your sourpuss theologies because all you do, is look for heresy under every rock. Cut him some slack. Is that a fair opposition to this, or do they need to look more critically at this, to what the Council of Trent says?
Well, someone deserves slack if ordinarily they say orthodox things. So if Pius XII, for example, made a slip of the tongue and said something in a way that he shouldn't and was ambiguous, you would say, well, of course the man meant the Catholic doctrine because he adheres to Catholic doctrine in all other things, and he's absolutely integral with regard to his profession of faith. But because according to rules of interpretation, you cannot give somebody slack or a good interpretation if they are, in general, unorthodox. You would go the other way, that what they mean is something unorthodox. So if somebody has an attitude toward Catholic doctrine which is one of repudiation or devil may care and has really no care to conform to Catholic doctrine, then it is perfectly reasonable to take what he says as heresy. And it would be unreasonable to give him a beneficial interpretation. That's the first thing. Secondly, it cannot really be interpreted well to say that it is not true faith, especially in view of what Trent said and what Pius XII said. It is clearly contrary to faith. It is contrary to what he learned even in his novus. Well, he spent some time in a traditional seminary, we have to say. I mean, it is so well known as Luther's doctrine. It is so well known as Protestant doctrine that faith is only faith if you put it into practice. As Protestants say, well, if you fall back into sin, it shows that your faith wasn't really there. If you've thrown yourself on the Lord and you have embraced Christ as your Savior, and then you fall away, well, then they say your faith wasn't really there. Is that identification of interior acts of trust is so typically Protestant. Faith for the Catholic is assent to truths revealed by God and proposed as such by the infallible Catholic Church. That's the definition of faith. And that can exist even if you are in the pits of sin, even if you don't do any social work among the poor, because that's what he's referring to. It concerns merely your assent. And that's very important, too, for the sinner, because even if he has committed 1,000,000 mortal sins, if he still has that light of faith on in him, in other words, that there is still that connection to Christ and to the Church through faith, he has a possibility of return. It's something like your electronic machines, where even when you shut them off, there's still a light on. It's still plugged in. It has an ability to bring itself up again. And so the same is true of a person who retains the faith, even if he doesn't have charity, that is love of God, because he's committed sin. For him to say that to people, that if you're if you're not doing good works, you don't have faith, that totally cuts them off. That leads them into despair. That means I have no contact with God. I have nothing. There's nothing left of my baptism. And it's besides being a heresy, it's very uncharitable and can do tremendous damage.
It also reflects, I think, Bergoglio's statement does, his peculiar idea of faith, essentially this idea of faith as an encounter, an experience with Jesus. And we've heard him talk about that several times. And for the modernist, someone with a modernist outlook, a modernist understanding of faith, it's something that comes through experience. So you don't really have part of the experience unless you have these works. So therefore, you don't have true faith. So it's tied up, I think, as well with that.
Yes, it goes back to the modernism of a certain personality called Maurice Blondel at the turn of the century, who came up with the theology of action, that something is not really true for you unless you put it into action. That's Maurice Blondel. He was a modernist, and it's a reflection of the same thing. That is that truth is activity. It is not conformity of the mind to what is. It has a necessary connection to activity, and it's not really true for you unless you're active.
And that would be,
for those of you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That would be very much in line with the thoughts of Blondel. He would have influenced the theologians that Bergoglio eventually studied after Vatican II. So it's not surprising to find that.
I'm surprised he won't be canonized along with St. JP2 and St. J23. It's coming up soon. That'll be another show.
Oh, yeah.
April the 27th. Indeed, we're getting very close to it. Well, for those of you who are just joining us, you're listening to Francis Watch on the Restoration Radio Network, sponsored by Novus Ordo Watch. Be sure to visit www.novusordowatch.org to check out the latest news coming out of Bergoglio's Modernist Vatican, and you can keep up to date with all that. Some very good commentary and analysis and insight there. I'm your host, Justin Soder, and this evening I'm joined by His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn, Rector of Most Holy Trinity Seminary in Brooksville, Florida, and Father Anthony Cekada, Assistant Pastor of St. Gertrude the Great Catholic Church in Westchester, Ohio. And tonight we've been discussing the last 30 days of news, particularly the consistory bombshells that came out on the topics of divorce and remarriage and sacraments for divorced and remarried. We want to remind you that Francis Watch is a production of the Restoration Radio Network. All rights are reserved, and any duplication without explicit written permission is forbidden. Permission can usually be very easily obtained by writing to mail@truerestoration.org. If you're listening to our show on iTunes or Stitcher, please make sure to leave some ratings and reviews. This would help us. It gives us a chance to help those looking for truly Catholic programming to find our programming easier, more easily. So that would help us out if you would leave some ratings and reviews. So kind of moving on here from this topic of experience, Father, we moved to a Vatican Insider story on the 22nd, where the title of the headline, the headline of the story was, Jesus did not teach an ideology, but a way, a journey. And so we hear Francis telling the Novus Ordo Cardinals at the consistory that Jesus did not teach an ideology. Here's the quote, "This is something striking about the Gospels. Jesus is often walking, and he teaches his disciples along the way. This is important. Jesus did not come to teach a philosophy, an ideology, but rather a way, a journey to be undertaken with him, and we learn the way as we go by walking," unquote. Now, something that I find very, very telling here, Your Excellency and Father. This is a little revelation from Francis that falls into the words mean things department. Look at the choice of words he uses. Jesus came to teach a way, not the way to eternal life, but a way. Did you catch that?
Well, the first part was so absurd that I didn't listen to the rest of it. First of all, ideology for him means the faith, the true faith, doctrine, dogma. So, to say that is so absurd. Let's take the 16th chapter of St. Mark. Those who, that is the command to go and teach the gospel to the whole world, every creature, etc., and those who do not believe shall be condemned. Now, how is that not ideology? How is that merely walking? That those who do not believe shall be condemned. To someone answer that question. I mean, it's so absurd to say he did not teach. And what about the whole attitude of the church in the early centuries against heresy? How they were so sensitive to heresy in the early centuries. All the doctors of the church writing against heresies. If Christianity is not an ideology, if it is not a doctrine and a dogma. So, but of course you're right to say it's a way. That means there are many other ways, which is perfectly in accordance with Vatican II, that the Holy Ghost does not refrain from using non-Catholic religions as means of salvation. Sure.
Mm-hmm. The other point is the journey language, and that again is 60s code for dogmatic evolution, that we're walking along here, and we have this particular idea at this point on our journey, and that's fine, and that sustains us for a while, but we're a pilgrim people, and we're going to be marching on to another destination and find another good thing on the way, and maybe discard what we had taken along with us before. So again, it's the idea of this evolution.
I think it was Ratzinger that used the analogy of a cruise. I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
I think
well,
Ratzinger,
he was talking
you
about doctrinal anchorages.
Substantial
anchorages.
Yes, where you pull into this port and you buy the trinkets here, and then you pull into the next port. And it's standard modernist fare. I mean, it's like the McDonald's menu when you pull up. I mean, it's standard fare everywhere. So there's really nothing new here.
Mm-hmm. So we move on now to Catholic morality, the headlines in Catholic morality, and this also harkens back to the Second Francis Watch episode last month, and it's talking about the pre-synod survey. This Synod of Novus Ordo Bishops, which is on tap this October, and the headline is "Most Reject Teaching on Contraception." I know we're all shocked, right? I mean, that's just,
shocking.
Anyway, it says this is it's shocking, isn't it? So this is the story from the National Catholic Reporter, who reports on the Novus Ordo Bishop Robert Lynch down here in our neck of the woods, Your Excellency, in St. Petersburg.
Yes. Yes.
As,
that
he's
diocese.
Yes. Sure. He's your...
he's my quote-unquote bishop.
That's right. So the story reads here the following. He says that a new pre-synod survey shows that what people, and this is, of course, the people that actually remain in the Novus Ordo pews, that most regular church-going Catholics in the diocese find the Church's teaching on artificial contraception no longer relevant. He says, quote, "On the matter of artificial contraception, the responses might be characterized by saying that train left the station a long time ago. Catholics have made up their minds, and the Sensus Fidelium suggests that the rejection of the Church teaching on this subject, even the choir, the 78% of respondents who said they attend Mass at least every Sunday and Holy Day, overwhelmingly said that most Catholics they know do not accept the Church teaching on natural family planning and birth control." So, this sort of begs the question that, so what does this synod really matter about anyway? I mean, they're coming out with all these things, and I think, Your Excellency, you spoke about this last month. I mean, they're coming up with all these things to try to get more people confused, but they don't care.
No, they have no faith. These are people that lack the virtue of faith, so they have no objective norm to compare their beliefs to. I mean, it's whatever they think, whether it's the clergy, whether it's the high clergy, whether it's the people. It's just whatever pleases them. That's what that Novus Ordo religion is. I mean, to compare it to Catholicism is absurd because it really has no relation to Catholicism. Catholicism, by its very nature, is dogmatic and unchanging by its very nature, and the Novus Ordo is something that just changes from day to day. It has no anchor at all in any kind of objective reality. So yes, and this is all in Pascendi. Pascendi said that the modernists say that dogma should reflect the attitudes of the people. It's right in St. Pius X's condemnation of modernism. There's nothing that is surprising to us here. It's just that they're getting more bold, I would say. I think that Bergoglio has brought out something that has been latent, and that is a final admission that the traditional teaching of the Church has been abandoned or ought to be abandoned for a completely new religion. They're just getting bolder with it, more theoretical maybe. That's the only difference, but it has all been there for a long, long time.
Mm-hmm. The idea that people have no more faith, that sounds like an extremely severe judgment. However, when you get right down to what the Catholic notion of faith is, there's the idea of adherence to what God has revealed. You really don't have that idea anymore. This idea of adherence to dogma, adherence to Catholic doctrines. It's become like a brand. You identify yourself with Catholicism, with this organization called the Catholic Church. You like its traditions. Certain of its teachings maybe you understand. They appeal to you. But ultimately, there's not the real Catholic sense of faith.
So moving on here, we have another story. This is sort of the wishy-washy, we believe nothing on birth control thing. On March the 5th, a National Catholic Reporter story where Bergoglio says the Church must take into account what is possible on birth control. And the article speaks about how Francis views Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae, and he essentially says, well, quote, it all depends on how you interpreted Humanae Vitae, Francis says in the interview. The same Paul VI, in the end, recommended to confessors much mercy and attention to concrete situations. So this, here you have again this whole mindset being reflected in everything we've talked about in the first part of this show.
Yes, as I said, they've been doing this for decades. That was Paul VI's code word for let them use their consciences. And we have seen that. That's why 85% or whatever it is, high majority of people who call themselves Catholics believe in artificial birth control, because they have been led down that path by the clergy since the 1960s. And so, the adultery thing is just bringing it out of the closet, that's all. I mean, it's just nothing new here. I mean, what's the difference between the pastoral approach of Bergoglio and what Paul VI says in that encyclical? And then when the French episcopate rejected it, he said nothing and did nothing. This is dogmatic chaos, and it has been dogmatic chaos ever since Vatican II. And it's not going to get any different, and it's just going to get worse and worse. And the Novus Ordo conservatives will have a harder and harder time saying nothing has changed. I don't know if you noticed that poll but only 4% objected to Bergoglio.
Right.
4%.
Well, I mean, this is why he's on the cover of Time magazine and Rolling Stone. I mean, he's loved by everyone because he doesn't believe anything and doesn't require them to believe anything. So of course he's going to be popular. And the 4% that reject to it are probably the people like us that just are considered the extreme fringe lunatics.
It's the Novus Ordo conservatives who find him objectionable and irritating. But it's alarming that that's the only number you're working with here.
Right.
That this tremendous majority love him and think he's wonderful. Now, that same majority, if you were to impose the Catholic morality upon them, if you said everyone who is using artificial birth control and who dies impenitent of that sin will go to hell forever, if that were preached from Catholic pulpits, you would see that 85% get up and walk out or just not bother to come back. They do not have the faith. They are delighted with Bergoglio because he is giving them a free pass to call themselves Catholic on the one hand and to deny the faith on the other. The others have done it implicitly, but Bergoglio is really handing them a document practically saying this is all right. That's why he's so popular. But it's Vatican II. It's the idea is by pleasing these people, these apostates, these people who have turned on the faith long ago in the 1960s, who were corrupted in the Catholic schools in the 1960s and 1970s, by pleasing these people, by making the religion conform to them, you're going to get them back somehow. And it isn't happening because we saw that the Francis effect was not bringing in more people. It was getting him on the front of magazines, but it is not bringing in more people, not even those people, not even the deniers of the doctrine. They are not showing up at the Novus Ordo Mass, as a result of Bergoglio.
Mm-hmm.
It's another flop for Vatican II, that's all.
Mm-hmm. So we move on here to another story. This is a sort of a sidestep away from Bergoglio for a moment, but, being here in the United States, we certainly saw this headline. And this was from the marquee apostate in the United States, Cardinal Timothy Dolan, who's the Cardinal Archbishop of New York. He came out with a statement on the 27th of February to give his 2 or 10 cents worth on the story about the University of Missouri football star Michael Sam, who came out as a gay athlete, and he was going to enter the NFL draft as the first openly gay player in the NFL. And Dolan said that he, quote, would not judge the athlete for his sexual orientation. And this is his quote here. Good for him, Dolan said in an interview with NBC's Meet the Press, airing on Sundays. I would have no sense of judgment on him, Dolan continued. God bless you. I don't think, look, the same Bible that teaches us well about the virtues of chastity and the virtue of fidelity in marriage also tells us not to judge people. So I would say, bravo. I don't even know.
Well,
I mean, Your Excellency, I don't even know what to say to this. I mean, I'm just beyond words.
Somebody on Rorate said he is judging him because he's making a judgment that it's okay.
Well, yeah, true. Yeah.
I noticed that on Rorate, that I forget who said it, but that he is making a judgment. That he's approving of it.
The kind of judgments that Bergoglio and company are against is negative judgments that say that someone is guilty of something that objectively is a sin. But bravo and good on you. That's great as far as judgment goes.
If we say for a moment that this person is not engaging in sins, if we just say that he has announced that he has this disorder, how could you say bravo to that? This disorder, it'd be like if somebody said, I am suffering from bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or something. If someone were to say that, you wouldn't say bravo. You would say, well, that's you have a serious affliction, and I'll pray for you. That's the only reaction that you could have to such a thing. And he should have said that this is a particularly bad affliction because it inclines somebody to commit very serious sins. It's not like just a disease, or it inclines somebody to commit very serious sins. So that you would feel sorry for such a person, and then you would have to say such a person with such an inclination would have to lead a life of the chastity of an angel because of that type of inclination. That is if we exclude the idea of anyone's, that whatever person is actually committing sins. But usually when people announce that, they are saying effectively, usually what is understood is that they are engaging in this sort of thing. And so for him to say that, for Cardinal Dolan to say that, it is effectively giving approval to sins against nature and inclination to sins against nature. I mean, this is so hardcore. How could anybody say that? How could anyone with the Catholic faith rejoice at such an announcement? You would say this is a terrible tragedy. That's the only word you could use for it. It's a terrible tragedy. We're very sorry to hear such a thing. But again, it goes back to the fact that there's no objective morality. The Novus Ordo was going to abandon all of the traditional teaching concerning same-sex marriage and homosexual activity. They're going to abandon all of that in the name of subjectivism. That there is no objective morality. And so if somebody says, I am doing this, that, or the other thing, I'm inclined to this, that, or the other thing, well, bravo, that's your conscience, that's what makes you feel good. It's all from the same poison source, and that is the abandonment of precisely what the Catholic Church is by its essence, and that is the guardian of truth, an objective truth. And this truth is what has built up Catholicism for all of these centuries, and it is being torn down in a matter of decades by these modernists, and there's soon going to be just nothing left. I mean, there might be people in churches, but they're not Catholics. They're not identifiable with Catholicism of times past.
Mm-hmm. Well, the last story topic here that we have in this category, and this one here is so scandalous and so beneath the pale. And I'm gonna let Your Excellency respond to this one first, and I'm gonna get Father's weigh in on this as well. And that was the story on the 6th of March. It was a report from the Associated Press that revealed that Francis openly said that he decided that in the heat of the moment that he would steal the cross from his dead confessor's rosary from off the body in the casket. And here's how the story goes. On March the 6th, Francis revealed in a meeting with priests from the Diocese of Rome that many years ago, when he went to pray at the open casket of his confessor in Buenos Aires, he forcibly removed the little cross from the rosary with which the priest was to be buried and walked away with it. "Give me half your mercy," were the words he uttered as he took the item. There had come to his mind, quote, "the thief we all have inside of ourselves," unquote, Francis explained, adding that he still has the cross in his possession and keeps it on his person in a little pouch underneath his cassock even today. Your Excellency?
Well, I would say probably that was a venial sin on his part, and he probably did it out of a certain sentimentality. If that's all he has done, I'm not too concerned. But it does show the fact that he would talk about it and make light of it is serious. He should, and the thief that is in all of us. Well, sir, speak for yourself. I haven't ever stolen anything from anybody, and I never had an inclination to steal anything from anybody. the whole attitude is one of flippant. It's corruption. Those are the two things that come to my mind. That you would speak about that in such a way.
Especially someone in his position, putative position, because what are people going to think? And it's what occurred to me right away is that it's, as Bishop Sandlorn said, it may be something that's venial in itself, but the scandal that you give in the sense of an example to do something similar is really pretty bad, because the example I would give would be a kid who's caught stealing, and his father tells him to give it back, and the kid says that, well, the Pope didn't give back what he took. Why should I have to give it back? So it on a global scale, it conveys something that's truly scandalous and truly wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So so moving on now, it was kind of a quiet month in the traditionalism department here at Bergoglio, probably because he was too preoccupied with the consistory and all the hoopla surrounding that. However, there was a big news break on Rate Caeli earlier this month, on the 3rd of March, about the Novus Ordo Bishop Michael Olson of the Fort Worth Diocese. That's Texas. He's the second youngest Novus Ordo bishop in the United States, and he decided to completely ban the saying of the traditional Latin Mass at Fisher Moore College, quote, for the sake of the souls, unquote, of those wanting to attend the Old Mass. Now, this isn't an accident, because Fisher Moore is, to my knowledge, Fisher Moore has prided itself on being a very, what would you call it, extraordinary form college. And now, and now they receive the Franciscans of the Immaculate treatment. So, Father, it sounds to me like Summorum Pontificum is alive and well, doesn't it?
Well, and what's going on here is, I think the bishop of the area figured out that this is the new party line. He took seriously Francis's different statements and different declarations, and he looked at the example of the Franciscans of the Immaculate, who had their chops busted, and he then looked at the situation in his own backyard and decided that he would do something similar to follow the new line, as it were, to make an example of them. So the people involved obviously regarded it as quite a tragedy. But I have the feeling that we're going to be seeing more of that.
I think they had exclusively the so-called extraordinary form.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I read. They never had, or that was just was not found there. And I heard they're not having anything right now. Yes. And this was on the heels, I think, of some scandal over somebody. They had a financial problem, I think, or I'm not sure about it, but there was a big financial problem, and this was just icing on the cake for them. They managed to pull themselves out of a financial problem, and then this new bishop, practically as his first act, virtually shuts them down. I mean, it effectively shuts down at least what they're doing or what they're trying to do. They'll have to redefine themselves and reinvent themselves with the Novus Ordo.
They've gotten their support precisely because they had the Old Mass, from people in the Novus Ordo institution, and now they've had that pulled out from under them.
Yes. It just shows the hatred. There's a new spirit of hatred. And just another, talk about a little incident. I don't know if you saw that on YouTube, but Mr. B was coming out of the Santa Marta, and there were two little altar boys in very traditional outfits. And one of them had his hands folded very attentively and beautifully, and in the traditional way, it was pointing up and all. And Bergoglio stopped, as he's coming out, and says, "What are your hands glued together?" and purposely pulled his hands apart Now, that's a tiny incident, but it is very indicative of the hatred in Bergoglio's soul. The hatred, because he saw that as pre-Vatican II, and he was going to ban that from his sight. Now, in a situation like that, I mean, just in our own situation, when you see certain things going on in ceremonies and whatnot, you just sort of pass over them. You don't, if you see somebody doing something wrong or that bothers you, you don't stop everything and you know, especially if it's minor, and say something about it, because it's contrary to your position. You shouldn't be that petty, so to speak. You know, you have to get through it. But for him to do that tells me that he has a deep, deep hatred for the traditional Mass, everything pre-Vatican II, which we knew already. But that incident, I think, says it even more, and that it tells us that the hatred is even deeper than what we thought.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for our listeners, I'll find the YouTube clip of that, and I'll put it in the show notes on RestorationRadioNetwork.com, so you can click on it and see it. I remember seeing that when it first came out, and you're right, Your Excellency. I mean, he was walking right by, and a stop determination says, what are your hands glued together? I mean, it was so, I mean, he stopped everything he was doing to go to that, so you're absolutely right about that.
And that poor boy will be scarred for the rest of his life by that incident.
Absolutely.
That the so-called Holy Father told him not to do that when he was doing something perfectly correct. He will be scarred by that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he will.
He will remember that for the rest of his life.
Yeah, we cannot have outward acts of piety.
No, goodness no.
Okay, so now we move on to the anti-conservative category. But before we do, I want to remind listeners that you're listening to Francis Watch on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, Justin Soder, and I'm joined this evening by His Excellency Bishop Donald Sanborn, Rector of Most Holy Trinity Seminary in Brooksville, Florida, as well as Father Anthony Cekada, Assistant Pastor of St. Gertrude the Great Catholic Church in Westchester, Ohio. And today we've been covering the Bergoglio Consistory and also some of the other news headlines that have come out in the last 30 days since our last show on February the 20th. Okay, so now moving on to the anti-conservative here. This is one of the more obscene headlines from Bergoglio in the last month. This was on the Vatican Insider, posted on February the 27th, where he was addressing the congregation of Novus Ordo bishops. Bergoglio was explaining in his personal speech to them what type of bishops he wants, who his men are, and what he doesn't want. And the story headline reads this: "Bishops mustn't be apologists/crusaders." And here's his quote: "Quote, men who are guardians of doctrine, not so as to measure how far the world is from doctrinal truth, but in order to fascinate the world with the beauty of love, with the freedom offered by the gospel. The Church does not need apologists for her causes or crusaders for her battles, but humble and trusting sowers of truth who know that it is always given to them anew and trust in its power. Men who are patient men, as they know that the weeds will never fill the field. Don't fight those who promote error or immorality in modern society, and don't try to convert them." Unquote. So, Your Excellency, I guess he's saying he doesn't want you to be a guardian of doctrine anymore. I mean, so it's pretty clear here.
I would say at least it's refreshing that the modernists are showing themselves. Mm-hmm. I would say at least that. I mean, this is obviously total abandonment of the Church's mission to teach, to rule, and sanctify the faithful, to preach the gospel, to answer heretics, as St. Paul says we must do, whether in season or out of season. This is the history of the Church. The Church has always been this, and now they are abandoning the very essential role of the Catholic Church, which is to protect its doctrine, and the first role, because if the Catholic Church does not profess true doctrine and is not in conformity with the teaching of Christ and revelation, everything else it does is vitiated. It's worthless because it all rests on the edifice of the faith. If it breaks the faith, the apostolic faith, if it breaks from that, it becomes a worthless, phony institution. And I think it's refreshing to me that these heretics are finally declaring themselves to be what they are. Well, again, what is very disappointing to me is that the Novus Ordo conservatives will not see it, will not wake up and see what they're facing, but are still trying to salvage something in these people and are still making believe that these people are Roman Catholics.
Mm-hmm. Too, the quote really pulls the rug again out from the Novus Ordo conservatives in the United States and I'm sure elsewhere. These men are always urging that the bishops attack this problem in society and attack that problem and denounce this sin and that error and so on. And the message that Bergoglio is giving is very clear that they should not do that. They shouldn't be crusaders. So
it's a form of contradiction. In other words, he is preaching a doctrine. He is giving them an instruction. He is contradicting himself like every skeptic does. You see, you can't be this, you must be that. So he's giving them just a new ideology and a new set of commandments, that's all. So he contradicts himself.
Well, this is sort of an extension of his statement late last year that proselytism is solemn nonsense. That's sort of reflective in this, don't try to convert them. I mean, when has the Catholic Church ever said we're not trying to convert anybody before Vatican II? I mean, don't try to convert them. Those who promote error or immorality, don't try to convert them. That's just, right. I mean, you're right, the mask is coming off. It really is.
Yeah. We don't have to take it off anymore. It's coming off.
Yeah.
The little elastic on the back has sort of worn out and is just breaking.
It's just sliding down the face. So, okay, so now we move on to a topic that I want Father Cekada to address because he spent some time addressing this. And, Father, this is the topic that the story broke on the 20th of February, which is actually the date of our last Francis Watch. And our call screener was texting me during the show saying, look at this. But because we were tight on time, I didn't bring it up. And that was this most ridiculous, sentimental, sappy, ecumenical lunacy that Bergoglio put out when he was addressing this Pentecostal evangelical preacher named Tony Palmer, who calls himself a bishop. Now, Tony Palmer is as much of a bishop as I am, okay? Now, Bergoglio not only addresses him as such, but calls him his brother bishop, and proceeds to cut a 7-minute video and gives the farm away, throwing doctrine once again to the dogs. Now, Father, I watched this video, and it's just embarrassing. And you wrote a video you wrote an article called Mr. Bergoglio's Neighborhood. You want to talk about that and the language of the heart?
Oh, that was funny.
Yeah, that's right. I don't know if people are old enough to remember this, but there was a kids show on PBS called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and there's this Presbyterian minister who had this sort of likable way about him, and he sort of push the idea of like generic niceness and cooperating with other children, but there's no religious dogma involved, and that's all I could think of when I watched this video. I mean, virtually the only thing missing was the sweater. He cut this, made this film, or gave a little discourse, which this the Protestant bishop recorded, and hit different themes such as, well, we're going to speak the language of the heart here. He referred to this guy as brother bishop. It was addressed to a Pentecostal group, and he talked about how groups like this come together to receive the Spirit. We can see God is working this way all over the world. Then he spoke of them, and by extension, the putative Catholic Church, as families that come together, families who are in the same neighborhood. And that we had these misunderstandings that have divided us, and there's a long road of sins that we all share the blame for. We have diverse traditions. You have your traditions. We have ours, but we have to encounter each other as brothers. Then he concludes by saying, let's give each other a spiritual hug. and I ask you to bless me, and I bless you. From brother to brother, I embrace you. So this was the tone of it, and I found it very interesting because we have a real unfiltered Bergoglio here. He's not working from a script, and we're not getting it. We're not getting it from Vatican Information Service or VIS. This is just Bergoglio talking, and I mean, it really speaks volumes about his ideas. This idea of, he talks about the language of heart, and what we have here again is this personal experience that he's talking about, and it's the opposite of the Catholic understanding of faith, where we have the adherence of the intellect to what God's revealed. So we have that, and then the idea that he is addressing someone who is not either a priest or a bishop, and who is a heretic, is my brother bishop. It's crazy. It diminishes the papacy, which is also part of Bergoglio's program, by putting himself on the same level, and then it gives this guy some legitimacy as a brother bishop. And then the other the crazy points, the group that he's talking to is an outfit run by a man named Kenneth Copeland, and he is a television preacher, a television minister, and it's a Pentecostal ministry. They speak in tongues and jabber on, but we're supposed to see in this, from what Bergoglio says, God working all over the world. And they're also the difference between Catholics and the Pentecostal followers of Copeland is that we're simply different families with different traditions, and you've sinned and we've sinned, and this separates us, and this is something that's very unfortunate. So in a couple of hundred words, unscripted words, he managed to give everything away. In other words, give the store away as in terms of Catholic ecclesiology, the papacy, the distinction between heretics and Catholics. And after this, there's absolutely nothing left. I mean, if you take these principles at their face value, and certainly if you take them to their logical conclusions. So it was a really unbelievable performance. I mean, my jaw dropped when I first saw it. I couldn't believe it. I really couldn't. But I experienced it, so I guess you would say that I believed it. So.
One of the Argentinian priests that we have here said the video was so bizarre, it sounded as if he were drunk. And then a Novus Ordo priest said to me that that he questioned Bergoglio's state of mind. He said he says so many bizarre things, and then he says things and retracts things and says them, that he wonders about his state of mind.
Yeah, he was.
I don't know. I mean, whatever that's worth. I really don't think that there's any question about either his sobriety or his state of mind. I think that he was speaking from his faithless heart, and this is what he really believes: that there is no objective dogma, and everything he said on that little video was exactly what he thinks, and it's very consistent with what he thinks.
Yes.
Yeah, don't you find it fascinating? He didn't send mutual blessings and hugs to the Franciscans of the Immaculate.
No.
But
evil.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, those people don't get it. But the Protestants, there's been an interesting reaction to this. The Protestants have jumped out and started pointing out Bergoglio's errors. There was a blog article on thetruthwins.com entitled "Pope Francis and the Emerging One World Religion." So they're seeing through this. They're seeing through this nonsense because they see him doing the same thing, like in talking about, make sure that the Muslims share their faith in the Quran and on and on and on. So I think this isn't going over well with them. It's going over far better with the pew sitters in the Novus Ordo than it is with the Protestants.
Well, the Protestants probably still believe in God. I think that's probably the difference.
Yes, very true.
There was actually I don't know if I mentioned this before, but there's a Lutheran satire channel that several months ago had an animated cartoon of Bergoglio making the different bizarre statements he had made up until that point, and then had the voice of someone who was supposedly Vatican commentator coming on and correcting and retracting what Bergoglio said. And it was very, while it was funny, there was a lot of good insight there because they picked up on that. They had him speaking English as sort of a hippie type of delivery or accent, but it was actually his words. So, people on the outside can definitely see something like this, can see the contradictions.
Mm-hmm. Father, would you like to take the next one here? This kind of falls in the miscellaneous category here of these topics, but it does bear mention on the show because it's just a further reinforcement on where Bergoglio is going and what his whole position is here on the sacred liturgy, if you even want to call the Novus Ordo the sacred liturgy. But anyway, there was a story on Pray Tell blog that came out on the 21st of February. Do you want to talk about that, where Bergoglio praised the Vatican II Constitution, Sacrosanctum Concilium?
Sure. He was called upon to make some statements for the 50th anniversary of Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, which is the first document that Vatican II passed and approved. So, among other things, he said the following. He said, liturgy detached from spiritual worship would risk becoming empty, declining from its Christian originality to a generic sacred sense, almost magical, and a hollow aestheticism. As an action of Christ, liturgy has an inner impulse to be transformed in the sentiments of Christ. And in this dynamism, all reality is transfigured. To our gratitude to God for what has been possible to achieve, he said, it's necessary to unite a renewed willingness to go ahead on the path indicated by the Council Fathers, as there remains much to be done for a correct and complete assimilation of the Constitution of the Holy Liturgy on the part of baptized and ecclesial communities. So we're in the world of code again. By aestheticism, empty aestheticism, he is taking a shot at the ornate Ratzinger style of doing the Novus Ordo, of dressing it up with all these traditional accoutrements. Then, by speaking of dynamism and impulse, what we get there is more modernist code about the internal impulse and experience. And then when he speaks about assimilation, that's code in liturgy speak for enculturation. In other words, adapting liturgies to what they would call the genius of different cultures. And you saw them doing that in Brazil, I think, on the beach there. So this is more of the same in the way of code, that we're not going to go the way that Ratzinger was going with this dressing up of the new worship in the old accoutrements, but we're going to go in a different direction. So this is what he's preaching on this point. He probably doesn't think about liturgy very much. Probably has very few ideas about it, except he knows what he doesn't like, and he certainly doesn't like the traditional Mass or anything that is related to it. So here he's tracing out where we're going to go.
It's the same old story of more Vatican II.
Mm-hmm.
Another shot of Vatican II.
I want to take just one quick moment here. We're coming up on the top of the hour, and Your Excellency and Father, if we can just beg maybe 15 more minutes of your time after the top of the hour to finish the show. We have a few more stories to get to, but I wanted to remind our listeners that our live feed will cut at the top of the hour, at the 2-hour mark. Those of you who are on hold, we do have one caller that we want to get to for His Excellency and Father to answer some questions. You will be able to hear the show if you're on with us, but if you're listening live, you'll be able to hear it probably about 5 minutes after the show spools to our RSS feed. And you can go in later on, download it, and fast forward to about the 2-hour mark and hear the remainder of the show. So just, you'll be able to hear the show, don't worry. All right, so let's move on to the next topic here. This news story, Father, that came out about Bergoglio saying, well, we have to fight against any discrimination. And this again is when he was speaking to the cardinals at I believe this was at the Consistório, where he's speaking again about what he's wanting and the ideology he wants, and he says he then shifted the focus abroad, stressing the duty of the new cardinals and the entire church to support, quote, all Christians suffering from discrimination and persecution. Francis also went out of his way to broaden his appeal to include every man and woman suffering injustice on account of their religious convictions. We have to fight any discrimination. Telling the cardinals to be peacemakers, he concluded by asking for peace and reconciliation for those peoples presently experiencing violence, exclusion, and war. And again, he's talking about this word exclusion. Your Excellency, that's a code word, isn't it? What does he mean by exclusion?
It's the document on religious liberty, warmed over in the microwave. That's all. I mean that document says that no one should be coerced to act against his conscience in matters religious. Well, again, I would say, well, what about those people in the airplanes driving them toward the towers in New York? I mean, they were acting in accordance with their conscience. They thought they were doing the will of Allah. And they should not be coerced to not do that. It's an absurd statement. The only thing that has rights is the truth. And people who are doing something wrong, whether it's for a religious reason or not, should be coerced not to do it. I mean, that's just common sense. And look what he did with the Immaculata people. He didn't respect their conscience very much. He coerced them in spades. He made life miserable for them, and he excluded them and did horrible things to them. They were just following their conscience. So he's a hypocrite. He's a Pharisaical hypocrite.
In addition to that, I kind of took the quote in this direction, that the exclusion and the discrimination, these were words that he actually threw into his speech that weren't part of the written text, but the reporter picked them up. And these are the code words in a secular society for the program of the approval of homosexual rights. The LGBT, UVWXYZ, their rights program. And this is something that you see in secular discourse all the time, that you can't exclude these people, they can't be discriminated against. So we have to fight against any discrimination. And I would see that in light of his other statement about civil unions, that we have to look at individual cases. That was something, another statement he made over the past couple of months. So he's floating these secular ideas out there with the understanding that people will get the code.
Mm-hmm.
And people do get the code.
They do. They understand. There was somebody on one of those talk shows that say, I really like this Pope. He uses bad language. He he's in favor of gays and all sorts of things that he understood from Bergoglio's statements. Even the message is very clear to the people of the modern world that I'm with you. This was, he's making a joke about his slip where he used an Italian word that should not be used. We won't hold that against him. But the comment was that this person is somebody I really like because he is conforming really to my own image.
And you can't say that Bergoglio is being misinterpreted because he did not live under a rock down in the bottom of Argentina in Patagonia somewhere. He was familiar with the way that modern secular society operates, and he knows how they use language, and so he knows the kind of impression and conclusion that people are going to take away from his words, and that's why he speaks them. So it's not a question of him being someone who is naive and subject, therefore, to misinterpretation.
Mm-hmm. So the next story that we have here, and we touched on this just a little bit earlier, was about this in the Francis effect, which Pew released a new poll which came out with some significant statistics of thinking of the man in the Novus Ordo of Pew. 68% of Catholics think that Francis is a major change for the better, and 77% of Catholics support allowing the use of contraception. So we've talked about these numbers, but I think it's important to talk about this story because here's the reference. It's a Pew poll. It just came out, and these are the most current as of March the 6th. So, Father,
my first reaction was that, Catholics really like Bergoglio, but he's still not as popular as contraception. So, he really has to work to get his numbers up a little bit, to give contraception some competition.
Yeah, give him some time.
Give him some time, but when you see something like this, the Pew polls are always very interesting when they speak of what Catholics think. It really confirms what we've been saying for years about the effects of 50 years of Vatican II. That it destroyed the Catholic faith. And there are statistics to prove it. All modernists love sociology because it gives you, I guess, the sensus fidelium, the idea of what the people are thinking. So here's the proof for it. Here's the proof for the effect of Vatican II.
Mm-hmm. And the next story that we have here, we also touched on this very briefly a few minutes ago, was we'll have, according to this is a Chiesa Espresso Repubblica story. This is an Italian newspaper talking about the 6 new saints to be canonized, quote unquote, outside the rules. It's certainly talking about John the 23rd and not having a miracle. In fact, there was a headline just the other day. We didn't link to it in the show plan here, but somebody came out and said, I can't remember who it was in the Vatican, which said, beyond a shadow of a doubt, there is no miracle with John the 23rd's body. Did either of you two hear that?
No, I didn't. No.
Mm-hmm.
It demonstrates once again how hard it is to keep up with things.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
I think it was either John Paul II. Somebody said it was either Bergoglio or John Paul II who said his whole life was a miracle.
Oh,
now there could be some funny things said about that, but again, I'll hold back.
We'll take a pass.
But I think it's safe to say we'll be doing a show on the JP2 quote unquote canonization coming up here soon. So
definitely.
Stay tuned. Stay tuned for that one. And the last story in the stack here.
To get to the specific issue that the story raised, there is a type of procedure called an equivalent canonization, which apparently popes had used now and again in the past, something outside of the regular procedure. But what Bergoglio did in just a couple of months, less than a year, that he canonized 6 people using this particular procedure.